Hey everyone, it's me, Spider-Man, and boy do I love the cops. Today we will... Yeah, this isn't working. Yeah, okay. Spider-Man. Historically, Spider-Man has often been held up as Marvel's resident working-class superhero, and for good reason. Amidst characters like a playboy billionaire, an alien god prince, and a pretty blunt symbol of American exceptionalism, Spider-Man, a guy who has to juggle a job with his superheroics while struggling to make rent, is probably the most relatable of Marvel's flagship characters to the average working person. Many of Marvel's heroes can afford to live a life largely unburdened by the pressures of capitalism, either by being insanely rich or by not even being bound to the rules of our world or plane of existence. Peter Parker does have to grapple with those pressures though, and is often at the verge of buckling under them. This has been a part ever since the character was conceived, as a kid from a single-parent household in a poor neighborhood of New York who repeatedly puts himself in danger so he has pictures to sell to the newspaper The Daily Bugle, which he has to do to make rent and support his Aunt May financially, who doesn't have an income anymore since her husband died. No, we do not acknowledge the brief period in which Steve Ditko turned Spider-Man into a mouthpiece for Ayn Rand. The Spider-Man PS4 game from 2018 honors that legacy in several ways. One of the first things we see in the game is an overdue bill that slid under Peter's door, for example, and he actually gets evicted from his apartment during the game. This is all pretty cool stuff, so it's a shame the game also portrays him as a class traitor. Let me explain. Part 1. Empire's State of Nature. In 2020, the Black Lives Matter movement gained a lot of public support following the murder of George Floyd, foregrounding a lot of discussions about the institution of the police and the role they should or should not play in our lives. Many people called for a radical defunding of the police, and even calls for the complete abolition of the police gained mainstream attention. This, for a lot of people, went a bridge too far. Especially in the US, it's plain to see for a lot of people how the police as it currently exists is an institution of militarized, racist, extrajudicial executioners. And certainly we couldn't go without the police altogether. We would all need some kind of armed force patrolling the street, or else chaos and anarchy, not the cool kind, would certainly break out, right? Well, the belief that human beings are all fundamentally self-interested animals who will slit each other's throats at a moment's notice as soon as we become inconveniences to each other is a persistent one. It's an idea that was probably most influentially argued by Thomas Hobbes in his 1651 piece of monarchist propaganda called Leviathan, a book that is, regrettably, still considered one of the fundamental texts of political science. In it, Hobbes imagines a state of nature, that is to say, a hypothetical situation in which there is no state to legitimize certain kinds of violence and punish others. He imagines this state of nature as a war of all against all, in which he imagines life to be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. A state, with a body that wields the power to inflict legitimized violence on its citizens, for our purposes a police force, is the only way to ensure we live in such a way that we can all enjoy a long life in a state of relative security. We need a thin blue line, if you will, to keep society from falling into a state of absolute violent chaos. Spider-Man PS4 seems to mostly buy into this view of the world. The game starts with Spidey and the cops taking down supervillain Wilson Fisk, aka the Kingpin. I say supervillain, but he doesn't really have any special powers, or a costume, or a supervillain nickname that's more than a job description. He's a mob boss, basically. Anyway, when the guy gets locked up, it becomes clear that his power over the world of crime was the only thing keeping a lot of violent thugs at bay. As soon as he's gone, Manhattan starts being plagued by armed robberies, hostage situations, kidnappings, joyrides, and other violent crimes. Manhattan turns into an orgy of violence that the police, with the help of Spider-Man, have to repress. In part, this is of course to give you as the player something to do in this open-world video game, but nevertheless, the writers thought this was a believable plot development to sprinkle in before any superpowered villains even enter onto the scene, an assumption that fits with a lot of other fiction. For example, the idea that people will turn violent on each other as soon as there's no state to keep them at bay, or at least enough of them will to turn society to absolute chaos, is basically the underpinning assumption of pretty much all apocalyptic fiction. The problem with this assumption is that it's not backed up by reality. The idea that people are inherently selfish creatures who need a police force to keep them from turning on each other is an ideological supposition, not one that's based on historical fact. There's many examples one could point to where state infrastructure broke down, and where people chose not to turn on each other for their own benefit, and instead chose to help each other, even the weakest among them, to survive. One such an example is the Siege of Sarajevo, a siege of over 4 years during the Bosnian War, in which citizens did not in fact turn on each other en masse, but helped each other as much as they could and even kept schools and hospitals running. Another is the Great Blizzard of 1888, one of the most severe recorded blizzards in North American history, which took the lives of over 400 people across the United States and Canada. People were given ample opportunity to turn on each other when every kind of infrastructure completely broke down, but instead, the records show people banding together to help each other. It sure seems that when we are given the opportunity to prey on our neighbors for personal gain, the vast majority of us choose not to. Sure seems we may not actually need an armed police force constantly patrolling the streets to make sure we all behave. Moreover, there were and are a lot of societies that don't have a state with a body to administer legitimized violence that have not collapsed into the state of nature that Hobbes describes, such as many indigenous cultures. Now I know that Hobbes didn't mean that the state of nature was a time period that actually existed at some point in history, but it is his point that that's what society would become without a state monopoly on legitimized violence, so the existence of coherent, peaceful, stateless, policeless societies does kind of disprove him. Part 2. Why Spidey is a class traitor. Spider-Man PS4 really wants you to know that Spidey and the police are on the same side. There's this ongoing bit throughout the game where Spidey pretends to be a character called Spider Cop, a gruff detective who doesn't play by the rules, but who gets the job done. Yuri Watanabe, his contact within the NYPD throughout the game, is referred to as his partner, and they frequently assist one another. When Spidey swings onto the roof of a police station to literally hack into their crime detection systems, and there happen to be cops nearby, they reassure him that they won't tell on him and they've got his back. Spidey works with cops multiple times throughout the game, and MJ even writes an article that unironically uses the term hero cop. The dialogue keeps insisting that some cops view Spider-Man as a menace, but to my memory, you meet all of one cop who actually behaves antagonistically towards Spidey, and of course you turn him around on that over the course of one mission. All of this isn't surprising, because Spidey functionally is a cop. His superheroics consist entirely of beating up mostly street-level thugs and leaving them there for the police to arrest. All of this stands in shrill contrast to how the game otherwise portrays him as a working-class person. If you're not very familiar with class analysis, you may raise an eyebrow at hearing this. Many people's conception of cops is that they simply uphold law and order, so how can they be anti-working class? Well, the order that the police uphold is far from a neutral order. It is a rule of law that hugely advantages the owning class over the working class, because it springs forth from a political system in which the wealthy have a giant amount of undue influence. A rule of law that favors the rights of property over the rights of housing, food, health, or even life. If, for example, a homeless person is camping out on someone's property and the owner calls the police, the homeless person will be removed, possibly even arrested, even though it would probably also have been illegal for them to sleep almost anywhere else. It is legal for a business to throw out entire landfills of perfectly good food while almost 1 billion people go hungry, only to keep the prices up, but it's not legal for a hungry person to quote-unquote steal food from a dumpster. These are all things that Peter should know very well, since he literally volunteered at a homeless shelter. White supremacy is also enshrined in the law, meaning it's way harsher and more consistently enforced for people of color than it is for white people, and that a lot of laws specifically exist to hurt communities of color. Crack cocaine, for instance, is chemically virtually identical to powder cocaine, but because the former is more used by black people, 14 US states have a higher maximum sentence for possession and use of crack cocaine than they do for powder cocaine. I hope I don't have to tell you this anymore, but police are also way more likely to kill black people without so much as a hint that they even did anything wrong. Let's not forget that we're dealing with the literal NYPD in this game. Of course, not all of the law is bad, so not everything the police do is bad. The truth is, though, that the vast majority of police time is not spent on violent crime and keeping people safe, but on enforcing the criminalization of homelessness, protecting capital, harassing people of color for looking suspicious, shooting a worrying number of their own dogs, and driving around aimlessly in circles to give the appearance of being busy. If there is such a thing as a good cop, it is a cop who quits a weekend because he realizes what he signed up for. If you want to know more about how the involvement of cops makes basically every societal problem worse, I would recommend reading The End of Policing by Alex Vitale. It's probably starting to dawn on you how Spidey is betraying the working class by backing the cops, and how it's not in his own material interest to do so. Spidey loses his apartment in the game because the law allows landlords to charge people for the basic need of housing, to charge them for nothing but the hard work of owning a building and maybe sending someone every once in a while to do the repairs that landlords are legally responsible for. Even though if we didn't allow that, we could solve homelessness instantly, since in pretty much every capitalist country there are more empty homes than there are homeless people. The law has determined that someone's right to their property, no matter how much of it they have and no matter how they use it, is more important than people's right to live a dignified existence, or indeed survive at all. If Peter chose to defy those warped, unjust priorities by, say, refusing to leave his apartment, guess who would show up to uphold law and order, and guess whose side they would be on. Part 3. Judicial Whack-A-Mole. Let's not mince words. Cops are violent. In fact, threatening or committing violent deeds is the main goal of their existence. Even the most bootlicking cop lover probably can tell you that cops do not commit violent acts. The idea, however, is that the violence that cops do is justified. One important justification behind the kind of repressive justice that the police enact is that it will act as a deterrent to other criminals, and thereby reduce crime. The problem with this is that it simply doesn't work that way. The wonderful thing about Spider-Man PS4 is that it, in spite of how propagandistic it otherwise is, unintentionally agrees that repressive justice does not work. As I said earlier, you start the game by sending mob boss Wilson Fisk to jail, after which a bunch of street-level thugs immediately crawl out of the woodwork to fill the vacuum he left behind. Defeat them, and not long after that, Mr. Negative's gang members are committing violent crimes all over Manhattan. Not long after that, you'll be fighting escaped Rikers inmates throughout the city, and if you finish the game having stopped all crimes, the low-level thugs from the start of the game will pop up again to commit more. Again, I get why this was done from a gameplay perspective, to keep the player busy throughout the entire game, but it does give you the distinct impression that Spidey and the cops playing whack-a-mole with criminals doesn't accomplish a whole lot, which is unintentionally a pretty good mirror to the good that police work actually does in real life. Just as in the game, in real life more police doesn't actually result in a reduction of crime. The only thing that reliably reduces serious crimes is improving people's standards of living. Turns out most people have to be pretty desperate before they commit any serious crimes. Chancing for more blue on the street may win you some votes by appearing to be tough on crime, but if you actually care about reducing violent crime, which has been in decline for decades in the global northwest by the by, long before the modern trend of police militarization, then you would invest in a solid social safety net, which actually costs less money than operating a giant surveillance and repression apparatus and an overcrowded prison system. Speaking of prisons, yeah, the same thing is true for those. It may satiate some people's hunger for retribution to lock people up for decades under absolutely inhumane conditions, but if you actually care about keeping people safe, you might look towards countries with more humane and rehabilitation-focused penitentiary systems, because they have far lower recidivism and lower crime overall. Speaking of absolutely inhumane conditions, during the course of the game, a bunch of inmates are broken out of Rikers, a New York prison that has been described as a human rights atrocity and looking like a slave ship. But you can actually hear escaped Rikers convicts in the game lamenting how it wasn't actually that bad in prison, how they at least got 3 hots and a cot in there, and how that may be preferable to their situation after they escaped, so it can't be that bad, right? And hey, they all behave like crazed maniacs and immediately take over the city, so they must deserve to be in there, right? It's not like this game takes place in a country where you can get years upon years for, say, non-violent drug crimes, is it? It's not like people of color are disproportionately locked up over there and locked up for way longer, right? It's not like they made these prisoners a lot more racially diverse, read whiter, than they are in real life, right? So Spidey must be the good guy when he's helping send them all back to their human rights atrocity of a prison, right? Right? Part 4. With great power comes no accountability. Yes, I am proud of that line. Spider-Man PS4 has the rare honor of calling something Orwellian and having me agree with it. A character in the game says this in reference to the so-called crime monitoring system that's being used by the NYPD, which basically consists of a bunch of towers on top of police stations throughout the city that are being used to track down crimes, which I can only presume means they're doing some serious mass surveillance on the New York populace, basically listening in on everyone in case they're doing a crime. While I hate to see the themes of George Orwell's 1984 consistently flattened down to surveillance state, that is one of the things the book explores, and in that sense, yeah, these towers are definitely Orwellian. What's more, as I've mentioned before, The police are more than happy to look the other way when Spider-Man hacks into these towers to better be able to track down crimes. So not only are they themselves listening in on a staggering number of New Yorkers, they also look the other way when other people try to tap into these huge amount of sensitive information, as long as they figure that that person is probably on the same side. So it sounds like I'm agreeing with the game here, right? It's presumably making a statement against sweeping powers for the police to commit mass surveillance on citizens, something I can surely only agree with. Well, not quite. The person making these remarks is none other than J. Jonah Jameson, who in this game is transformed into an Alex Jones kind of type, mouthpiece for extravagant conspiracy theories, who's continuously slandering Spider-Man and basically saying anything he can to drum up fear to get people to listen to his podcast and buy his merch. Having him be the person to make these remarks communicates that they're obviously completely deranged as far as the game is concerned. Truly, a great argument for more police power. I say, maybe the police shouldn't have sweeping powers of mass surveillance. The game says, and I'm left destroyed by facts and logic. This all becomes a bit awkward when later on in the game it does kind of challenge the idea of unlimited power for the police, while also really trying to make it clear that it isn't actually what they're doing, because video game publishers are cowards who are afraid of making any statement whatsoever. Partly through the game, Norman Osborn, mayor of New York, responds to a supervillain-led crime wave. Again, in the real world, US violent crime has gone down steadily since the 90s and broadly throughout its whole history, by hiring a private military firm called Sable to patrol the streets and keep the peace. This, of course, immediately backfires. They perform mass arrests on peaceful protesters, they extrajudicially lock people up for basically no reason, they erect watchtowers along the city, they confiscate people's possessions just because they want to, and they're not even that good at catching criminals. They are private military super cops, and for once, Spider-Man actually takes a stance against that shit. Sabotaging the activities of Sable becomes something you can do throughout Manhattan, and the game actually labels them as crimes. So again, seems like the game is taking a stance against police militarization, right? Having a heavily militarized police force with sweeping powers patrolling the streets leads to flagrant abuses of power, as this game neatly demonstrates, yes? Well, again, not quite. Because the game really wants you to know that these Sable agents are not cops, and will frequently remind you of the differences between the two. The Twitter feed you can read throughout the game, yes, there's a Twitter feed in the game, shows New Yorkers criticizing the Sable agents, but never the police, and many of them will actively suggest the cops as an alternative to Sable, keeping it vague whether the powers or the people wielding them are the problem. Of course, the game also conveniently establishes a scenario in which these powers themselves might seem justified, which, again, at one point in the game, if you listen for it, you can hear one Sable agent saying to another how they can basically get away with anything, because they have no badge or ID number. The implication, of course, is that police do have those things, and can therefore be held accountable. If you think cops being afraid of accountability is realistic in the year of our Lord 2022, then I've got more to explain to you than I have time for in this video. Suffice it to say that cops being held accountable for the atrocities they commit is the very rare exception to the norm. Sable agents drive tanks through the city, whereas the cops drive regular old cop cars, but in real life, US police forces can and very often do use military equipment and vehicles, bought at a discount from the US Armed Forces. The thing where Sable agents just take people's property for no reason? Yeah, that's a real thing that cops do, called civil forfeiture, a legalized shakedown tactic that accounted for almost $4.5 billion of the Justice and Treasury Department's budgets in 2015. But you wouldn't know that from playing this game, which constantly valorizes the actual cops. If you want credit for commenting on sweeping police powers and militarization, then you should actually comment on sweeping police powers and militarization. As it stands, the game doesn't meaningfully criticize the creep of ever more sweeping powers for police in the US and elsewhere. Part 5. Spider-Lib. As we have seen, the police can do very little to actually reduce crime, because they can't actually address any of the root causes. The game tries to have Spider-Man do a little more than just beating up criminals to help the city, but those attempts largely fall flat, because Spider-Man 2 fails to consider any kind of response to systemic problems, instead focusing on alleviating a few individual problems. Take homelessness, for example, a problem that could be solved by just giving the homeless one of the empty houses that outnumber them, a problem no truly advanced society should have. What does Peter do about this problem? He volunteers at the homeless shelter that's run by his aunt. Which is a cool thing to do, don't get me wrong, but focusing on this kind of thing helps obfuscate where the responsibility really lies for solving homelessness. It gives the false impression that charity alone can make sure nobody has to sleep on the street, and it never shows any of the ways in which homelessness is effectively criminalized. I'd like this game a whole lot more if Spidey could, say, help homeless people who are being chased by cops for the crimes of sleeping and stealing from dumpsters, or if he could help in stopping evictions. It wouldn't be very realistic for him to oust the mayor and seize all empty properties, but he could be helping in ways that don't obscure the roles that the government and the police play in keeping people homeless. The game offers a similarly half-baked, individualistic, liberal solution to environmental issues. Oscorp, the corporation headed up by current mayor Norman Osborn, is causing all kinds of environmental damage throughout the city. Luckily, Osborn's son Harry has set up a bunch of research stations around the city, researching ways to monitor and undo this damage. All Spidey has to do is use these stations to find the sources of pollution, a few bad exhausts for example, or a few places where water is being polluted, and the problems are gone. In doing this, Spidey convinces the Oscorp board that Harry's research is worthwhile, which might mean that pollution won't be as bad in the future. So apparently, all we have to do to stop companies from polluting is appealing to their better nature? Hoping that environmentalism is actually more profitable? Maybe getting a better CEO at the top? This is of course gibberish. Shareholders are the ones who ultimately determine the course of a company, and they always prioritize short-term gains over environmental impact. They won't do anything to stop their own pollution unless they're forced to. You might also have noticed that the kinds of pollution the game talks about are all very minor, things Spider-Man can fix in a single afternoon. Larger, more long-term problems, like, say, the oncoming climate apocalypse, are never even mentioned. I'd say the game also propagates such an individual-focused, non-systemic, non-solution to the problem of bad cops, since it does portray a few cops at the beginning of the game as corrupt, being on Fisk's payroll and turning against Spider-Man when he goes to confront the mob boss. That's really the worst criticism this game gives cops. There's a few bad apples, as police representatives love to say when yet another cop commits a completely unprovoked murder. In reality, the problem isn't a few bad apples. It's that all the other apples form a wall of silence around the bad apples to make sure they never get convicted, and the role Apple unions play in protecting the bad apples, and the role that the entire Apple organization serves in oppressing minorities and the working class. This metaphor is getting away from me. We should also consider the fact that a job that allows you to establish your authority over others with little to no accountability naturally attracts people with authoritarian personalities and fantasies. So no, getting rid of the bad apples as they go bad won't do a whole lot. Let's not forget that the original saying goes, a few bad apples will spoil the bunch. You might have just watched this probably immensely long video and thought, so what? Are you suggesting that I'm a bad person for enjoying this Spider-Man game for children because of how it portrays the cops? And no, I'm not. Spider-Man PS4 isn't meaningfully more pro-cop than any other piece of media, and if you could only enjoy media that is ideologically pure, then there would likely be very little left to enjoy. That this level of Copaganda isn't unusual is kind of my point though. I think a major reason why it's so hard for most people, including myself, to conceive of a society with a different kind of policing, if any policing, is that we're indoctrinated with a pro-police ideology from every angle as soon as we can consume media. The point is not to feel bad about your enjoyment of a Spider-Man game, I mostly enjoyed it myself, but to be better able to spot Copaganda when we see it in other media. Because if we want to keep ourselves from internalizing certain questionable ideas, we first need to be able to recognize them. If we don't, we can never move beyond them. Hey there, if you like this video and want to help me get noticed by the algorithm, you can subscribe, like, comment, do the things. This is a YouTube video, you know how these work. Thank you. Oh, and if you like this video, I could recommend you another video on a related subject by Verilybitchie about Spider-Man's portrayal as a working class hero in movies. It should be on screen right now.